It was a small wooden box, the kind you can buy at any craft store for jewelry making, stained a deep cherry that had faded along the clasp from years of thumbing open and shut. My husband Arthur's adult daughter Amanda held it out over the kitchen trash, and with 2 fingers like it was a dead mouse, said Dad was such a pack rat, and let it drop onto a bed of coffee grounds and eggshells 48 hours after we buried him. I let it sit there until she and her husband Greg had moved on to raiding the linen closet upstairs. Then I fished it out, still slick with sludgy grounds, and tucked it under my cardigan. I didn't know yet that the box had a false bottom. I didn't know that inside that hidden compartment, Arthur had left me a handwritten note that would become the anchor of a 2-year-long plan to systematically dismantle his daughter's entire life and force her into bankruptcy with a single eviction notice and a bill for back rent so large it made her lawyer choke at a deposition. But I knew the minute her fingers opened over that trash, that the game had already started, and I was going to win it from the shadows. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that patience is the most underrated instrument in a woman's toolbox. Now, let's unpack how a 47-year-old baker who looked like she couldn't hurt a fly pulled off a financial autopsy so clean the IRS auditor smiled. I was not born into money or power. I grew up in a 2-bedroom walk-up above a laundromat in Ypsilanti, the daughter of a machinist and a school cafeteria worker. The smell of industrial starch and hot lint from the dryers downstairs was the background note of my childhood, mixed with the metallic tang of the key cutting machine at the hardware store next door. My grandmother on my mother's side, a Polish immigrant named Helena, had arrived in Detroit in 1952 with a single suitcase, a 3rd-grade education, and a terror of paperwork that she methodically crushed by learning English from a radio and bookkeeping from a night class at a community center. She spent her last 20 years working as a hospital janitor at St. Joseph Mercy, scraping biohazard bins and waxing hallways on the overnight shift. Every morning she came home with her hands cracked from the industrial cleaners, wrapped them in dish towels soaked in warm olive oil, and then sat at the kitchen table with a ledger book and a pencil to track her savings. She believed that money was the only shield a woman had against a world designed to strip her bare, and she was not about to let her only granddaughter walk into that world unprotected. She structured a trust account with a very specific instruction. The funds were to be released to me on my 35th birthday, but only if I used them to acquire an unencumbered, income-producing, physical asset in my name alone. She had watched 2 of her daughters, my aunts, get financially gutted by men who drained joint accounts, ran up credit cards, and left them with nothing but custody battles and ruined credit scores. She was not going to let that happen to me. I didn't even know the trust existed until I got the call from her estate attorney the week after her funeral. She had been dead 3 years before I turned 35, and the trust had been sitting in a quiet little investment account, accumulating interest in a mix of municipal bonds and a money market fund, waiting for me to pick a target. By then, I had already built a life with Arthur. He was a big, gentle, flour-dusted man with knuckles permanently cracked from kneading and a warmth that could fill a room faster than the smell of proofing dough. He had been a widower with a 9-year-old daughter when we met at the Ann Arbor Farmers Market, where I was selling clover rolls out of a tent, moonlighting from my job as head pastry chef at the Barton Hills Country Club. I remember the first time I saw him. It was a Saturday in June, the air thick with the sweetness of early strawberries and the tang of goat cheese from the farm stand next to me. Arthur was the bread specialist at the market, renting a stall 3 spots down, and he was bent over a steaming tray of pull-apart milk bread, his glasses fogged, his apron dusted, laughing with a customer about a burned batch. His laugh was the kind that went all the way down to his belly and back up through his shoulders, and I fell in love with that laugh before I fell in love with the man. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a Lutheran church, and Amanda, then 11, stood at the altar with a scowl that I chalked up to preteen grief over her mother, who had died of breast cancer when she was 6. I told myself she would come around. I told myself that with enough patience and enough love and enough fresh-baked cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings, she would eventually see me as a person rather than an intruder. She never did. Even as a child, she would accept my gifts with a flat thanks and never meet my eyes. I tried taking her to the bakery on weekends, teaching her to roll out cookie dough, but she'd sprinkle extra salt in the batter when she thought I wasn't looking and watch me with a tiny, defiant smirk when the first batch came out inedible. Arthur would say she was just strong-willed, but I saw something colder, a calculating quality that surfaced in small cruelties. A missing 20 from my purse when she visited, a lie about a school project that needed $100 in supplies that turned out to be a spending trip to the mall, a birthday card she gave me one year that was signed Amanda, with no message inside, just her name printed in ballpoint pen like a label on a box she was required to hand over. Once, when she was 14, I caught her in the bakery's walk-in cooler, taking a bite out of every single eclair on a tray I had prepped for a wedding order, then replacing them so the tooth marks faced inward. When I confronted her, she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Maybe a rat got in. I told Arthur, but he hugged her and said, "She's still mourning her mom." I learned to keep my emotional expectations low and my financial guard high, but Arthur never did. He loved her with a blindness that I now understand was guilt, the guilt of a widower who couldn't replace her mother and who compensated with a bottomless checkbook. For 23 years, I was the engine behind what the community came to know as the Daily Rise, a bakery and café in a 2-story brick building on Main Street in a small Ohio river town called Gallipolis, a place that tourism hadn't yet discovered, but that had enough local loyalty to keep a good bakery afloat. I did the 4 A.M. Proof, the laminated dough work, the bookkeeping, the tax prep, the vendor negotiations, the equipment maintenance, and the deep clean every Sunday night while Arthur charmed customers and developed new recipes. I loved the work. I loved the smell of fermenting levain at dawn, the crackle of a perfectly scored boule, the rhythm of the sheeter when I was making croissant dough. I loved the mathematics of it too, the way hydration ratios and fermentation schedules were just another kind of equation, predictable and loyal if you treated them with respect. And I loved Arthur, so I didn't complain that my name wasn't on the lease or that the business license listed him as sole proprietor. It was a small town. We were married. I figured eventually we'd fix the paperwork. But Arthur had a blind spot the size of a walk-in cooler when it came to Amanda. He paid for her private art college in Savannah with a home equity line of credit on a house we didn't own, which I later had to restructure into a consolidation loan using my own savings as collateral. I remember sitting at the kitchen table at midnight with a stack of paperwork and a calculator, trying to figure out how to roll the balloon payment into something manageable without losing the bakery's credit line. I did it through a combination of a new term loan from a local credit union, a payment plan I negotiated with the college's bursar, and 6 months of zero personal spending. Arthur never saw the spreadsheet. He co-signed for the first car she wrecked within 6 months, a cherry red Mustang that she wrapped around a guardrail on Route 35 while texting, and the second car that Greg, the slick real estate agent with a leased BMW and a mouth full of unearned confidence, also wrecked within a year. Each time, Arthur would say, "She's learning." I would say nothing, but I would transfer money from the bakery's contingency fund into a separate account I didn't tell anyone about, because I knew the pattern would continue. He never saw her as the predator she was. I saw it the first time I found my mother's earrings missing from my jewelry box after Amanda visited for a weekend, and she claimed she had borrowed them and forgotten to return them. They showed up in a pawn shop 2 towns over that, Arthur, and I had to pay $75 to retrieve. He called it a mistake. I called it pattern recognition. My grandmother's trust released to me on a Tuesday in March 10 years ago. I remember the call from the estate attorney, a man named Mr. Kovacs who spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who had delivered thousands of life-changing sentences. He told me the principal was $187,000, and the accrued interest brought it to $210,743. I sat on the edge of my bed, the morning light just starting to filter through the lace curtains, and I felt my grandmother's hand on my shoulder from 5 years beyond the grave. That Friday, I walked into the office of a real estate attorney in Columbus named Elaine Brubaker, a woman who specialized in quiet ownership structures and asset protection for women in blended families. I had found her through a referral from a financial planner I trusted, and I sat in her conference room, a glass-walled space overlooking the Scioto River, and told her I wanted to buy our building. The Daily Rise had been leasing from a retired optometrist who'd moved to Scottsdale and wanted to sell the whole structure, the bakery storefront downstairs, and the two-bedroom apartment upstairs where Arthur and I lived, for $190,000. That was a fair price. The building needed a new roof within 5 years, and the electrical panel was original from 1962, but the bones were solid and the location was irreplaceable. Arthur didn't know the building was for sale. I didn't tell him. I knew he would want to put both our names on the mortgage or, worse, ask his daughter to invest, using his half of the option, which would have tangled my one clean asset into a mess. So I did what Elaine called the Wyoming Shuffle. We created a Wyoming limited liability company called C&D Properties, with me as the sole member and manager. The C&D stood for nothing. Just letters Arthur would never think to search. Elaine filed the articles of organization with the Wyoming Secretary of State, obtained an EIN from the IRS, and then registered the LLC as a foreign entity doing business in Ohio. The building purchase was funded entirely with the trust principal plus accrued interest, $210, $743 total after fees, no mortgage, no lien, total cash closing. I remember signing the closing documents in Elaine's office, the weight of the pen in my hand feeling like a scepter. I owned that building outright, every brick and pipe and strand of wiring, and the deed recorded in the Gallia County Recorder's Office in the name of an opaque limited liability company with no public tie to my identity. Arthur kept writing a monthly rent check for $900, which I deposited into the LLC's operating account at a small credit union in Pomeroy. That account paid the property tax, the insurance, and a maintenance reserve that I managed in a spreadsheet that tracked every roof estimate and every plumber's invoice. He never asked where the rent checks went after I took over managing the landlord's account, because I had always been the bookkeeper. It was seamless. I lived in an apartment I owned with a man I loved who thought we were tenants, and I baked bread in a storefront I held free and clear, and I kept that knowledge locked in a mental safe deposit box like the greatest chocolate cake recipe I never wrote down. For 10 years, I watched Amanda and Greg circle our lives like buzzards who smelled a future carcass. Greg flunked his broker's exam 3 times and settled for a salesman's license at a low-volume agency, where he spent more time posting motivational quotes on Instagram than actually closing sales. I remember one Christmas, he gave Arthur a framed print of a wolf howling at a moon with the caption, "Hustle never sleeps." And I saw Arthur's face fall as he realized the frame still had a $4.99 Goodwill sticker on the back. Amanda had tried to open her own artisan concept store in the short north with $40,000 of Arthur's co-signed loan money, and it folded in 8 months, leaving him holding the note and me quietly paying it off through the bakery's net income so the credit union wouldn't come after our equipment. Every holiday, every birthday, there was a whispered request for a small advance or a bridge loan that was really just a transfer of my hard work into their bottomless hole. I managed to block the worst of it through careful cash flow manipulation, always presenting the business as barely breaking even. The truth was, the Daily Rise had amassed a tidy surplus, but I kept 2 sets of books, the real ones on an encrypted laptop I'd bought with cash from a Best Buy in Charleston, West Virginia, and the show ones in a metal filing cabinet in the back office that Amanda had snooped once during a Thanksgiving visit and dismissed as the mark of a frugal old woman who couldn't grow a business. I saw her flip through the ledgers that day, her manicured nail tracing a column of numbers, and I heard her say to Greg, "They're barely clearing $30,000 a year. How do they even live?" That was exactly what I wanted her to think. I even had a second set of tax returns prepared by a separate CPA, one I paid in cash, that showed the bakery's income at half of reality. Those were the returns I left in the filing cabinet. The real ones were in a fire safe, bolted to the floor of a storage unit I rented in my maiden name. Arthur died on a Wednesday morning in late September, 11 days after his 63rd birthday, while pulling a sheet of sourdough from the retarder. An aneurysm the size of a grape in his anterior communicating artery popped without a sound. He was on the floor before the dough hit the rack. I found him 6 minutes later when I came down with the morning coffee, 2 mugs balanced in my left hand, my right hand still dusted with bread flour from the baguettes I had shaped an hour earlier. The coffee spilled first, a hot arc across the tile, and then the mugs shattered, and then I was on my knees next to him, my hand on his chest, my apron soaking up the coffee and the tears and the flour until it was a gray paste. The coroner later told me it was instantaneous. No pain, no awareness. Just one moment a man is alive, and the next he is gone. I sat on that cold tile floor for some amount of time I cannot measure, my mind running through all the things I should have said, all the times I bit my tongue about Amanda, all the mornings I should have stayed in bed with him instead of rushing down to feed the starter. The paramedics called the official time of death at 5:47 a.m. I called his daughter from the ambulance bay of Mercy Health, my voice so shredded I barely recognized it. She arrived 4 hours later with Greg in his leased Lexus, wearing a black dress that looked like it cost more than my entire month's inventory budget. She didn't hug me. She walked straight past my open arms into the apartment and began opening drawers. "We need to secure Dad's important papers," she said, not to me but to Greg, who was already behind her with a roll of black trash bags. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom and watched them strip Arthur's nightstand, his dresser, the small fire safe we kept in the closet for birth certificates and social security cards. They didn't ask. They didn't console. They inventoried. Greg pulled out my grandmother's jewelry box, a small rosewood case with a broken clasp, and held it up. "Is this worth anything?" he asked, and Amanda glanced at it and said, "Probably just costume." He threw it into a trash bag with a clatter that I felt in my sternum. By the time I had the presence of mind to intervene, they had filled 2 trash bags with documents and 3 shopping bags with Arthur's clothing, his winter coat, his watch collection, which was mostly Timex, but included one Hamilton I had given him on our 10th anniversary. Greg pulled open the nightstand drawer, the same one where Arthur kept his reading glasses and the little wooden box, and I watched him rifle through it, tossing Arthur's pocket watch against the wall with a clatter, before dumping the box's contents onto the bed. "This is all junk," he said, and Amanda agreed without looking, already focused on the insurance papers she'd found in the fire safe. The box was swept into the trash, and I saw it land with a soft thud on a banana peel. The viewing was on Sunday at Wilcox Funeral Home, the burial Monday morning in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the river. I paid for both from the bakery account because Amanda claimed she couldn't access any of Dad's funds yet. Greg stood next to me during the graveside service, his hand not quite touching my back, and whispered, "Don't worry, Sarah, we're going to take care of everything." His breath smelled like spearmint gum and coffee. I remember thinking, that's exactly what I'm afraid of. The cemetery was still wet from a rain the night before, and as they lowered Arthur's casket into the ground, I watched a single earthworm wriggle up from the disturbed soil, oblivious. I fixated on that worm while the minister spoke, because if I looked at Amanda's face, I would either scream or shatter. By Monday afternoon, the cemetery grass still raw from the backhoe, Amanda and Greg had convened an urgent family meeting in our living room. They sat on the sofa I had roof-ulstered myself 3 years earlier, a floral chintz I'd picked up at a fabric outlet in Columbus, and Greg slid a manila envelope across the coffee table. I remember the sound of that envelope scraping against the wood, a dry whisper that seemed louder than it should have been. Inside was a 2-page document titled Residential Lease Agreement between Arthur D. Richter as Lesser and Sarah A. Richter as Lessee, dated 5 years earlier. It specified a monthly rent of $1, $200 for the apartment, $2, $400 security deposit, and a 30-day termination clause. A notary stamp in blue ink filled the bottom corner. The lesser signature was Arthur's, but the loops were off. I'd watched that man sign hundreds of checks, delivery invoices, credit card slips. His hand had a tremor in the last 3 years, a familial essential tremor that made his R slant to the left. This signature was unnaturally steady, the ink pressure too uniform, as if it had been traced or printed from a scan. The lessee's signature was a clumsy tracing of my own name, the S wobbly, the H trailing into a straight line that I never made. I could see where the forger had pressed too hard on the downstroke, creating a little blot of blue ink. Greg cleared his throat and explained that, as Arthur's sole heir via a will they would be probating shortly, Amanda now owned all of Arthur's real estate assets, including this building. Because I was just a tenant, the lease would be terminated under the 30-day notice provision in paragraph 12, and I needed to vacate the apartment by Halloween. He also handed me a photocopy of a change of beneficiary form for Arthur's $75, $000 whole life insurance policy, when I had watched him faithfully pay every quarter from our joint checking account at Ohio Valley Bank. The form swapped the primary beneficiary from me to Amanda, signed by Arthur, and notarized on the same date as the lease, 3 months before his death. The notary stamp on that form had the name Linda Morrison, and the address listed was a bank branch on Sycamore Street. I knew that branch had closed 2 years earlier because I had a friend who worked there who had transferred to the Pomeroy location. I said nothing about that. Amanda told me, with a sympathetic tilt of her head that never reached her eyes, that she was just doing what her father would have wanted, and that she and Greg would, generously, let me stay in their guest room in their McMansion on the other side of town until I got back on my feet. She said, "You've been a part of this family, Sarah, and we don't want to see you homeless." I stared at the forged lease and the fraudulent beneficiary form, my eyes tracking the impossible notary stamp, the wrong slant of the R. The date that fell during a week Arthur had been bedridden with pneumonia and barely able to hold a spoon, let alone attend a notary appointment. For about 10 seconds I felt the world tilt. The grief, still so raw it felt like a physical wound, tangled with a fury so cold it made my fingertips numb. But then the part of my brain that had been running a business for 2 decades, the part that could look at a profit and loss statement and spot a misplaced decimal in 5 seconds, snapped into gear, and I realized. They don't know I own the building. They actually think Arthur was the landlord. That meant they had never done a title search, never checked the Gallia County Auditor's property records, never pulled the deed from the recorder's office. They had fabricated this entire piece of theater on an assumption. That assumption was my biggest advantage. I let my shoulders slump. I let my voice go thready and weak, the way it had been in the days after Arthur fell, before I'd had coffee or sleep. I said, "I don't understand, I thought." Arthur never said. I let a few tears drop, not faked, because the grief was still fresh enough that crying was as easy as breathing. I looked at the documents without focusing my eyes, playing the role of a grief-fogged widow so perfectly that Greg leaned back, his posture loosening, and gave Amanda a small, satisfied nod. I told them I needed time to process. They said they'd start moving my things to their guest room that evening, and Amanda added, with a smile that I now recognize as the smile of a person who believes she has already won, "You don't need to worry about anything. We'll handle the bakery, too." That night, after Amanda had hauled 2 boxes of my clothes to her car and Greg had helped me into their guest room, which was actually a converted garage with a pull-out sofa that smelled faintly of mold and gasoline, I waited until 2 a.m. The house settled around me, the furnace kicking on in a deep rumble, the distant sound of Amanda's white noise machine through the wall. The guest room had a single bulb overhead, one of those bare ones with a pulled chain, and it cast a harsh yellow light that made everything look like an interrogation room. I retrieved the small wooden box from my suitcase where I'd hidden it inside a rolled-up scarf. I had cleaned the coffee grounds off it earlier in the bathroom sink, wiping the exterior with a damp paper towel until the cherry stain gleamed again. Now I sat in the dim light of a single lamp, my back against the cold drywall, and examined it. The box was about 8 inches by 4 inches by 3 inches deep, with brass hinges and a small brass clasp. The velvet interior held an old pocket watch of Arthur's father and a cast-iron railroad key, both things Amanda had dismissed as junk. I had seen this box on Arthur's nightstand for decades and never thought much about it. Now, as I ran my fingers along the bottom, the velvet lining felt slightly too thick, like there was a layer of padding that didn't match the sides. I pried up a corner with my thumbnail, the fabric resisting with the tackiness of old glue, and then it lifted away cleanly, revealing a false floor made of thin balsa wood, precisely cut to fit the cavity. The wood was light, almost weightless, and underneath I could see a folded piece of linen notepaper, the kind from the stationery set I'd given him for our 15th anniversary. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the box on my lap and take 3 deep breaths before I could unfold it. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and Arthur's handwriting, the familiar uneven letters with the trembling descenders, filled one side. It read, "Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I've known about the building since the 2nd year. I found the LLC filing when I was cleaning out the storage closet, and I never said anything because I knew why you did it, and I was ashamed I hadn't been the one to protect you. Amanda is not to be trusted. I've caught her looking at my insurance papers twice. I didn't change the beneficiary. The original policy is in the safe deposit box at First Ohio Trust, box number 741, and the key is taped inside the back of the kitchen clock. Don't let her take what you built. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger. I love you. Tell the regulars I'm sorry about the sourdough. A.R. I read it 4 times. The first time, my hands shook so badly the paper rattled like a leaf in a windstorm, and I kept losing my place because tears blurred the words. The second time, I focused on the words, "I knew why you did it," and felt a wave of something complex, relief that he had understood, sorrow that he had carried that secret alone, and a deep, aching gratitude that in the end he had tried to protect me in the only way he knew how. The third time, I zeroed in on, "Don't let her take what you built," and the weight of those words settled into my chest like a locking pin sliding into place. The fourth time, I stopped on, "Tell the regulars I'm sorry about the sourdough," because that was pure Arthur, a gentle joke from a man who loved his customers and his craft so deeply that even in a note written for the worst-case scenario, he thought of them. I placed the note back under the false bottom, pressed the velvet down until it stuck, and sat in the dark for another hour, planning. Not with anger, not with grief, but with the same methodical cadence I used to scale a bread recipe from a single loaf to a bake of 200. I needed to know 3 things. Was the original insurance policy truly intact? What other fraud were they planning? And how long could I maintain the performance of a broken woman before I struck? I had no phone in the room because Amanda had said the guest room didn't have a phone jack, and she'd get me one soon. So I wrote my plan on the back of a gas station receipt with a stub of pencil I found in my coat pocket. I listed the bank, the clock, the policy, the building, and next to each I put a question mark. By 4 a.m., the question marks had become a timeline. The next 30 days were purely about information gathering and performance. I moved into Greg and Amanda's guest room completely. The converted garage with foam insulation peeking through drywall seams, a single window that looked out onto a strip of dead grass, and a floor that sloped 2 degrees toward a sump pump closet that gurgled every time it rained. The pull-out sofa had a metal bar that pressed into my hip no matter which way I turned, and the pillows smelled like stale aftershave. I let them see me in baggy sweats and Arthur's old cardigan, hair unwashed, shuffling to the bathroom at odd hours with the stooped posture of a woman who had been hollowed out. I accepted a cup of tea from Amanda, Lipton with too much sugar, and thanked her tearfully for taking me in. I watched their habits carefully, logging them in a small notebook I kept under the sofa cushion. Greg left for showings at 10 every morning in his leased Lexus, but by 11 his car was often back in the driveway, and I could hear him on the phone in the garage side yard, voice rising and falling in a frantic cadence. I caught fragments. Rollover, collections, can't make the balloon payment. He was in debt, deep debt. Amanda slept until 9 or later, then spent an hour on her phone in the kitchen, scrolling real estate listings and bakery franchise opportunities, while the actual bakery, now being run by a 19-year-old assistant manager named Tyler who had no experience with sourdough schedules, was hemorrhaging money. I didn't step foot in the Daily Rise for 3 months. I knew if I went back, I would either break cover or break down, so I let it degrade. Tyler, a well-meaning kid who could barely read a Banneton, let the levain die on the 2nd day. He started using commercial yeast for the country loaves, then for the baguettes, and the reviews started piling up on Yelp. Used to be incredible, now it's just okay. The croissants taste like freezer dough. Where is the woman who made those morning buns? I read every review from my phone, lying on the pull-out sofa at 1 a.m., and I felt a surgical kind of relief. Every negative review was a data point in my eventual damage claim. The bakery's revenue dropped 40% in the first quarter under their mismanagement. I knew this because I still had remote access to the accounting software, a QuickBooks file stored on a cloud server I had set up years ago for off-site backups, and Tyler didn't know to change the password. Every night, I logged in and downloaded the daily sales data, the inventory counts, the payroll hours. I built a separate spreadsheet that tracked the exact dollar decline, and I printed it on a library computer in the next town over, because I knew Amanda checked my room for receipts. During that first month, Amanda and Greg intensified their pressure campaign. They sat me down at the kitchen table twice a week, sliding new documents across the formica, each one a variation of a power of attorney or an asset transfer form. The first was a general durable power of attorney, that would have given Amanda sweeping control over my bank accounts, my Social Security deposits, and any property in my name. Greg described it as just a formality to help manage your affairs while you're recovering. I squinted at the tiny print, deliberately pointing to a line and asking, what does to sell, convey, or otherwise dispose of real property mean? I don't own any property. Greg's eyes flicked to Amanda and he said, oh, that's just standard boilerplate, it doesn't apply to you. But I knew it absolutely applied to me, because if they ever connected my LLC to my name, that clause would let them sell the building out from under me. I told them my vision was too blurry from the grief, that I needed to have a lawyer look at it, and I'd get back to them next week. Next week came, and I said the same thing. Then the week after that, they tried a caregiver agreement that would have authorized Amanda to receive a monthly stipend from my Social Security, framed as compensation for housing me. The agreement was full of blank lines where amounts should be, and Greg said they'd fill those in later. I told them I needed my doctor to sign off on it because of my cognitive state. That bought another week. Once, Amanda came into my room while I was pretending to nap and placed a document on my nightstand, a deed of trust for the apartment, claiming it would protect my tenancy rights. I waited until she left, then read it. It was a deed that would have transferred the apartment into her name with me as a lifetime tenant, and buried in paragraph 14 was a provision allowing her to sell the property with 30 days' notice. I shredded it, told her the next morning that I'd spilled tea on it and needed a new copy, and then repeated the cycle of delay. Every time they pushed a document, I played foggy, grateful, and confused. I apologized for being such a burden, thanked them for their patience, and promised I'd get to it soon. The more I deferred, the more they relaxed. I could see it in their posture. They had written me off as a broken woman who would eventually sign whatever they put in front of her because she had no fight left. That was the performance I needed them to believe. On the second day after the funeral, while Amanda and Greg were at the Gallia County Probate Court, trying to file a will I was certain was forged, because Arthur had never mentioned one, and I had found no original in any of our files, I walked the 6 blocks to First Ohio Trust. It was a brick building with a clock tower, the kind of small-town bank that still had a teller who knew your name and a vault in the basement. I wore Arthur's old trench coat and a scarf I pulled up to my chin, not because it was cold, but because I didn't want anyone from the bakery to recognize me and report back to Amanda. The morning air was sharp with the smell of fallen leaves and the river, and my shoes, a pair of worn loafers I'd grabbed from my apartment, made a soft scuffing sound on the sidewalk. At the bank, I presented my driver's license and the key I had retrieved that very morning. The kitchen clock was a cheap plastic rooster, a gag gift from a vendor that Arthur had loved because it crowed every hour with a tinny, distorted screech. No one had ever thought to disassemble it. I had waited until the house was empty, then turned the clock over, unscrewed the battery compartment with a dime from my pocket, and found the small brass safe deposit key taped to the inside of the back panel exactly as the note said. It was a tiny thing, no bigger than my pinky, with the number 741 stamped on the bow. At the bank, a clerk named Dorothy, who had been working there since before I was born, led me to the vault and helped me pull the long steel box. Inside was a folder with the original whole life insurance policy, dated 12 years earlier, and a handwritten note from Arthur on matching stationery. To whom it may concern, I have never changed the beneficiary on this policy. Any change form that appears after my death is fraudulent. My wife, Sarah R. Richter, is the sole intended recipient. I am of sound mind and I am writing this voluntarily. He had signed it and, crucially, taken it to a notary at First Ohio Trust, whose stamp and signature were logged in the bank's notary journal. A properly notarized statement, confirming the original beneficiary, executed 6 months before he died. The fraudulent change form with its fake notary was a paper tiger. I photographed everything with my phone, uploaded the files to an encrypted cloud folder I'd set up with a new Proton Mail account, and then left the originals in the box, where they were protected by bank custody. The insurance company hadn't paid out yet because the fraudulent change form had raised a red flag. Their special investigations unit had placed a hold on disbursement, pending review. I called the SIU from a burner phone the next day, identified myself, and gave them the bank's contact information and the box number. A detective named Carla Rojas took my information and began the process of pulling the original policy and comparing signatures. Meanwhile, I began the serious undercover investigation inside Greg and Amanda's home. I made myself indispensable in a way that also made them look helpless. The first opportunity came when their $200 Viking range stopped igniting on a Tuesday afternoon. Amanda was in the kitchen, frantically jabbing buttons, and I heard her on the phone with an appliance repair company that quoted a $200 diagnostic fee. She said, in that tight voice I was coming to recognize, that she'd have to move some funds around. I shuffled into the kitchen in my usual cardigan and slippers ensemble, and I said, I could take a look. I used to fix the commercial ovens at the bakery all the time, the old Hobart mixer, too. Greg laughed from the breakfast nook and said, sure, Grandma, give it a shot. I pulled the range away from the wall, unplugged it, and removed the bottom panel with a Phillips head screwdriver I kept in my pocket specifically for these moments. The igniter was shot, a common failure on that model. I traced the circuit with a multimeter I'd retrieved from their garage, a beat-up old Craftsman that had belonged to Greg's father, and that Greg didn't even know how to use. The igniter showed infinite resistance, an open circuit. I bypassed it temporarily with a piece of insulated wire to verify the gas valve still opened, and the spark module fired, then told them they needed a $45 igniter part from an online supplier. They stared at me like I'd conjured fire from dust. Amanda said, how do you even know how to do that? And I just shrugged and said, you pick things up over 30 years in a bakery. I ordered the part using their Amazon account, which Amanda left logged in on the kitchen tablet, and when it arrived, I installed it in 15 minutes, the range firing up perfectly. That fix opened a floodgate. The next week, the bathroom faucet in their hall bath started dripping. I went under the sink with a basin wrench and a headlamp I'd bought at the hardware store, removed the old cartridge, and found that the rubber O-rings had hardened to the consistency of plastic. A 10-cent replacement from a universal kit solved it. The drip stopped within the hour, and Amanda actually said, I didn't know you knew plumbing. I told her my father had taught me basic home repair when I was a teenager, which was true, and that I'd never stopped learning. The garbage disposal jammed a few days later, the motor humming against a spoon someone had dropped inside. I reached under the unit with an Allen wrench, manually turned the flywheel counterclockwise until the obstruction cleared, hit the reset button on the bottom, and it ran like new. Greg stood in the doorway, phone in hand, looking at me with a mixture of relief and something approaching unease, as if my competence was a light he hadn't noticed before. Then the garage door sensor went out of alignment, and I realigned the photo eye with a level and a screwdriver. The dryer vent was so clogged with lint, I pulled out a snake of fabric the size of a football using a long, flexible brush from the hardware store, and the dryer's efficiency improved immediately. I replaced a cracked window pane in the mudroom with a piece of glazing compound and a glass cutter, a skill I'd picked up when a stray baseball shattered the bakery's front window 10 years earlier. I tightened every wobbly cabinet hinge in the kitchen with a screwdriver, rebuilt the toilet flapper in the guest bath, and changed the furnace filter, which was so clogged with dust it looked like a gray brick. Each time, I fixed the problem quietly and efficiently, and each time, Greg would say something like, I was never really a mechanical guy, and Amanda would retreat to her phone, scrolling, uninterested. They had no practical skills. They had debt and arrogance and a veneer of success that I was discovering was as thin as a single sheet of puff pastry. My competence became a quiet threat that they didn't recognize because they saw it only as a convenience. They started leaving me lists. Fix the wobbly cabinet door, unclog the shower drain, change the furnace filter. I did it all, and every time I was alone in a room, I was looking for evidence. Greg's home office was a small room off the kitchen, about 8 feet by 10, with a hollow core door that he kept locked whenever he left. His lock was a standard quickset interior privacy handle, the kind with a pinhole on the outside you can pop open with a straightened paperclip. My grandfather on my mother's side, a second-generation Polish immigrant named Stanislaw, had been a locksmith in Detroit for 40 years. He'd owned a small shop on Cheen Street and had taught me how to rake a pin tumbler lock before I could ride a bike. I remember sitting in his workshop, the air thick with the smell of metal filings and lubricating oil, as he showed me the difference between a wafer lock and a pin tumbler, how to feel for the binding pin, how to tension the plug just enough to create a shear line. I still have his old tension tools, and I keep a small set in my purse, a half-diamond pick and a city rake, not because I expected to need them, but because his memory is a comfort. I waited for a Thursday afternoon when Amanda had taken the Lexus to a spray tan appointment across the river in Point Pleasant, and Greg was supposedly showing a property in Athens, at least an hour's drive each way. I gave them 30 minutes after Greg left, just to be safe. Then I walked to the office door, knelt, and inserted a tension wrench into the keyway. The lock was a basic wafer design, no security pins, and I raked it open in about 11 seconds, my ears tuned to the hallway silence. Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and toner. A metal filing cabinet stood in the corner, next to a cheap particle board desk with a closed laptop. The filing cabinet was unlocked, which told me they never expected anyone to get past the door. Top drawer, a folder labeled Richter Estate with a blue tab. I opened it and spread the contents on the desk under the light of my phone's flashlight. The original forged lease, the blue notary stamp, the false beneficiary change form. A letter from a notary public named Linda Morrison, who, I later searched online, didn't exist in the Ohio notary database. A letter from Greg to a loan broker at a hard money lending firm in Cincinnati, typed on his agency's letterhead, that read, "I need a hard money loan against the building at 101E, Main Street, Gallipolis. The property was inherited free and clear by my wife. The bakery covers the note easily. Need to move fast." That building, my building, the ownership of which was buried in a Wyoming LLC, was being offered as collateral for a loan that would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars. That was wire fraud, bank fraud, and attempted grand theft. I photographed every page with a document scanning app that automatically straightened and enhanced text. Then I uploaded the files to my encrypted cloud folder. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. Second drawer. 6 months of past due credit card statements from 7 different cards, one of them a business card in the name of a defunct LLC Greg had tried to start and abandoned. The total outstanding was $62,847. There was a home equity line of credit on their own house, a property they'd bought with no money down and a balloon mortgage that was 9 months delinquent. A notice from the county auditor that year's property taxes were unpaid. A notice from the Lexus financing arm that the car was in pre-repossession status. Greg and Amanda were a financial disaster. Their entire life was a house of cards held up by the next fraudulent scheme. I also found an envelope tucked in the back of the drawer, unmarked, containing a series of bank statements from an account at a credit union I didn't recognize. The statements showed large deposits, round numbers like $5, 000, and $10, 000, followed by rapid withdrawals. I cross-referenced the dates with my memory and realized they aligned with the times Amanda had asked Arthur for bridge loans over the years. Greg had been siphoning money into this secret account and draining it just as fast, likely to pay off the most aggressive creditors while he searched for the next big score. I spent 12 minutes in that office, photographing everything methodically. Then I relocked the door, returned to the guest room, and spent the next hour organizing the evidence. I created a timeline of the forgery, cross-referencing dates with Arthur's medical records and the bank's notary log. I traced the fake notary stamp to a template that could be bought on a website that sold novelty seals, and I documented the purchase with a dummy account if I could, but that wasn't necessary. The mere fact that the notary didn't exist was enough. I shared all of this with Elaine Brubaker during a secure video call late that night. Elaine is a woman in her early 60s, with cropped gray hair and a voice like a knife. She had been a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of Ohio before going into private practice, and she specialized in complex asset protection litigation. When she saw the loan broker email, she was silent for about 8 seconds, then said, "Sarah, I have handled 200 contested estate cases in my career, and I have never seen a more thorough self-draping scheme. They are emailing lenders claiming ownership of a property that belongs to your LLC. That is attempted larceny by false pretense under Ohio Revised Code 2913-01. We don't just have a civil case. We have probable cause for a criminal referral." Elaine contacted the insurance company's Special Investigations Unit directly. Detective Carla Rojas, a woman I'd spoken to briefly, flew in from the company's regional office in Chicago to meet with Elaine and me at a coffee shop in Columbus, where I wore a ball cap and sunglasses I'd never worn before. Carla was a former FBI agent, late 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a keen eye for document fraud. She had already pulled the original policy from First Ohio Trust and had compared the signatures. The beneficiary change form, she told me, was traced. She showed me the overlay analysis, a transparency sheet with Arthur's genuine signature that she placed over the fraudulent one. The genuine signature had a natural tremor, a slight wobble in the R and the C. The forgery was too smooth, the letters connected with a steady hand that belonged to someone else entirely. The notary stamp number, she said, belonged to a woman who had died in 2019, and the signature on the stamp was a poor scan-and-print forgery. The lease, she said, had been created on a home computer, the margins misaligned, the font size inconsistent with standard leasing forms. She also confirmed that the insurance company was freezing all disbursements and was referring the case to the Ohio Department of Insurance for criminal prosecution. As we sat there, the coffee growing cold, Carla looked at me and said, "Mrs. Richter, I've seen a lot of insurance fraud, but this is one of the most complete packages I've ever been handed. You've done half my job for me." I told her I'd had a lot of time and a lot of motivation. During this period, I made contact with a legitimate ally beyond Elaine and Carla. A bank compliance officer at First Ohio Trust, a woman named Margaret Yee, had flagged the forged will when Amanda and Greg attempted to use it to access Arthur's small savings account, which held about $14,000 in joint funds I was legally entitled to as the surviving spouse. Margaret, who had known Arthur and me for years, called me directly, circumventing Amanda's attempts to block my access. I drove to the bank on a morning when I knew Amanda had a hair appointment, and I sat in Margaret's small office, a room with frosted glass windows and a view of the safe deposit vault. I told Margaret the truth over a cup of burnt lobby coffee, that the will was fake, that Arthur had died intestate. Margaret didn't even blink. She pulled up the will on her computer, pointed to the witness signature, and said, "This witness is a woman named Carol Hensley, and I happen to know Carol from my Rotary Club. She moved to Florida 3 years ago. There is no way she was in Ohio to witness this document." She placed an administrative hold on the account and filed a suspicious activity report with FinCEN, the Treasury's financial crimes network. That SAR became another piece of the criminal puzzle, adding a federal money laundering angle to Greg's fraud. Margaret also gave me a direct line to the bank's legal department, who offered to provide whatever documentation the prosecutor needed. The probate court also became an ally. I had quietly filed a motion to probate Arthur's estate intestate, attaching my marriage certificate and an affidavit that no will existed to my knowledge. The forged will Greg and Amanda filed was so poorly done, with a witness signature from someone who had never met Arthur, that the magistrate dismissed it after a single hearing. I remember standing in that courtroom, a small room with wood-paneled walls and a faint smell of old books, and watching the magistrate, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, look at the forged will and then at Greg's sweating face. She didn't even need a handwriting expert. She held up the document and said, "The signature on this will is dated February 14th, but the notary stamp is from a commission that expired in December of the prior year." Greg tried to explain it away as a clerical error, but the magistrate just shook her head and stamped the motion to dismiss. Since I was the sole surviving spouse under Ohio's intestate succession laws, I was appointed administrator of the estate. That gave me legal authority to marshal all of Arthur's assets, including any accounts they'd been trying to raid, and it meant that when the time came, I could sue them for conversion of estate property. For the next 18 months, I lived in that windowless guest room and played the role of the meek, grateful widow. I let them believe I had no money, no resources, and no fight left. I continued to fix things around the house, not out of kindness, but because it gave me access to every room and every locked drawer as their trust in my utility grew. I fixed their printer, which had a constant paper jam, and while I was inside the machine, I found a half-shredded document in the paper tray, a credit application with my name scribbled in the cosigner field. I photographed it and added it to the file. Amanda started leaving her purse on the kitchen counter, her phone unlocked, and I used those moments to photograph text messages between her and Greg discussing the Richter situation. Messages that showed they knew the documents were fraudulent. One text from Greg to Amanda Reed. "The loan officer is asking for a title search. I told him it's an inherited property and we're waiting on the probate certificate. Stall him." Another Reed. "If the old bat ever figures out the deed, we're done." I saved every screenshot. I also began keeping a daily log of everything that happened, a composition notebook I filled with dates, times, conversations, and evidence. I used a simple cipher my grandmother had taught me, a substitution code where each letter was shifted 3 places in the alphabet, so even if they found the notebook it would look like gibberish. That notebook became my testimony backup, a contemporaneous record that any court would accept. The bakery, meanwhile, continued its slide. Tyler, the assistant manager, quit after 4 months, citing burnout and an inability to handle the volume. Amanda hired a series of increasingly desperate managers, one of whom had a substance problem and was caught mixing mimosas in the walk-in cooler. The health inspector issued 2 violations for improper food storage and a failing grease trap. I watched all of this from across town, and I didn't step in. I remember one afternoon, sitting in the guest room, I logged into the bakery's security camera remotely. The feed showed a fly crawling across the lens of the camera in the prep area. That camera had a motion sensor that should have triggered an alert to the manager's phone, but no one had checked it in weeks. When the old Hobart mixer broke down because no one had greased the gears, Amanda had to pay $200 for a service call, money she clearly didn't have because she asked me, in a voice that was trying too hard to be casual, if I had any savings I could lend to the business. I told her I had a small CD that was locked for the next year. She seemed to accept that, but I saw her jaw tighten. That night, I heard her and Greg arguing in their bedroom, their voices carrying through the thin walls. She said, "The bakery is bleeding, the insurance money is frozen, and your little loan scheme is going to get us all investigated." He said, "Just get the old lady to sign the POA. Once we have that, we can liquidate whatever she's hiding." I wrote that conversation down verbatim in my cipher notebook. About 16 months after Arthur's death, I decided it was time to move toward the final phase. I had everything I needed: a complete evidence file of their forgery and attempted fraud, a cooperating insurance investigator, a federal bank filing, a probate court appointment, and the quiet ownership of the building they were trying to steal. I also had something else: a medical staging plan that would sever any remaining emotional tie I might feel toward these people. Even after everything, a small part of me still remembered the 11-year-old girl at the altar, and I knew that part needed to die completely for me to do what came next. I contacted my friend Miriam, a retired ER nurse who used to come into the bakery every morning at 6 a.m. sharp for a sticky bun and a black coffee. Miriam is in her late 60s, wiry and sharp, and she had been aware of my situation from the early days. She had helped me discreetly with a few tasks, like picking up a package from a freight forwarder so Amanda wouldn't see it. Now I told her the details of a plan I had been refining for months. I needed to create a medical crisis in front of Amanda and Greg, a moment so stark and so revealing of their total lack of humanity that it would extinguish any residual guilt I might feel about destroying them financially. Miriam, who had seen far worse than a couple of entitled grifters, agreed to help. She had a small medical kit in her home, a leftover from her nursing days, and she brought out a blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter, and a selection of beta blockers from her own prescription. I have a prescription for atenolol, a beta blocker I take occasionally for stress-related heart palpitations. Miriam and I experimented with the dosage over 2 supervised sessions in her living room. A very small dose, about a quarter of my usual, dropped my pressure just enough to make me pale and a little dizzy, without any real risk. A half dose, which we tested on the second session, made me feel like the floor was tilting, my head swimming in a way that would be perfect for a convincing stumble. I practiced the fall, a clutch at the chest, a buckling of the knees, a collapse onto the rug with my head hitting the base of the coffee table leg in a way that looked dramatic, but caused no injury because I had positioned a small folded towel under the leg the night before. Miriam timed it and coached me on my breathing. She said my acting was convincing enough to fool a triage nurse. She also helped me set up a nanny cam, a tiny camera disguised as a USB charging block, which I placed on a bookcase in Greg and Amanda's living room where it had a clear view of the main traffic area. The camera fed to Miriam's phone, so she could watch remotely from her Subaru parked half a block away. We chose a Tuesday because that was the day Greg usually had the most creditor calls and would be home pacing. On the day, I woke up knowing it was the day. Greg had a stack of final notices on the coffee table, visible from the hallway, and Amanda had been on the phone earlier that week with a collection agency, her voice shrill. I waited until they were both in the living room, Greg pacing with a letter from the county tax assessor that had been forwarded from the bakery address. The letter was a duplicate tax bill, addressed to C&D Properties LLC, and it had been forwarded by the new postal carrier who didn't know any better. Amanda was frowning at it, mouthing the letters C&D. I knew that name would eventually connect for her, and I needed the medical event to happen before she had time to investigate. I took the 8-Nalol dose, waited 15 minutes until I felt that familiar lightheadedness, then walked into the room, clutching my chest in what I hoped was a convincing arrhythmia mime. I gasped, my knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the area rug, my head thumping against the base of the coffee table leg. I lay twisted on the floor, eyes open, making little choking sounds. I could see their feet. Greg's loafers scuffed at the toe. Amanda's ballet flats, one strap broken and repaired with a safety pin. Greg looked up from his debt notice, saw me, and said, "Oh, what now?" He stood, stepped over my legs with one deliberate motion, grabbed a specific paper from the coffee table, and started reading it again. His foot came so close to my face I could see the brand name on the sole. Amanda glanced at me for maybe 2 seconds, then turned back to the tax letter and said, "Greg, why does this say LLC? Did Dad have an LLC?" Greg didn't answer, and they started talking about whether they should call the county auditor. I lay there, my cheek against the synthetic wool of the rug, my pulse actually elevated now from the sheer shock of their indifference. A full 90 seconds passed. Miriam, watching from the car, saw everything on the camera feed. She waited the precise 90 seconds we'd agreed upon, then dialed 911, using a script I'd prepared that described a woman having a possible heart attack at that address. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later, and only when the paramedics were knocking on the door did Amanda walk over, nudge my shoulder with her toe, and say, "Sarah, get up, it's probably just anxiety." I kept my eyes closed until the paramedics came in and started assessing me. At the hospital, I was diagnosed with vasovagal syncope, a fainting spell, and released 3 hours later. On the drive back, Amanda took a call from a friend via the car's Bluetooth, her phone connected to the audio system, and she didn't realize I was listening. She said, "Honestly, I don't know how much longer we can carry her. The bakery is bleeding cash and the insurance money still hasn't cleared. She's a liability. Greg thinks maybe we should just put her in a state home." That was it. That was the moment any residue of family loyalty, any whisper of love for the girl I'd tried to raise, vanished like steam from a proofing cabinet. I decided then that I would not only evict them, I would ensure they understood with mathematical precision, down to the dollar and the day, the cost of every cruelty they had committed. The final 4 months were an administrative sprint conducted almost entirely in secret from the guest room. Elaine and I prepared a civil complaint, filed under seal initially, seeking a declaratory judgment that the lease was void and that C&D Properties was the true owner, an order of ejectment for the commercial premises, and damages for unjust enrichment. The back rent calculation was based on comparable retail leases on Main Street, with documentation from 3 local commercial real estate agents showing the market rate for a bakery space of that size was $4, $200 per month. They had been occupying the building rent-free, claiming to be owners but never paying a cent to the LLC, for 24 months by the time the complaint was ready. That was $100, $800 in past due rent. We also sought triple damages under Ohio's civil theft statute for the $75,000 insurance fraud, which came to $225,000 plus attorney's fees and costs. The total demand in the complaint was approximately $368,000, and if the court found intentional fraud, the statutory interest would compound at 18% per year from the date of the wrongful act. I remember sitting on the pull-out sofa, a calculator in one hand and a stack of lease comps in the other, and realizing that the interest alone would add over $18,000 a year to their debt. The criminal referral had been accepted by the Gallia County prosecutor, and a grand jury indicted Amanda on 1 count of felony insurance fraud, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of attempted grand theft. Greg was named as a co-conspirator. The indictments were sealed until the day of the confrontation. I had also quietly purchased a new building across the street, at 104E, Main, a former hardware store that had been sitting empty for 3 years. I bought it through a different LLC, Second Rise Holdings, funded by a portion of the insurance payout I'd received directly after Carla Rojas completed her investigation, and the company released the $75,000 plus $4,200 in interest. I didn't tell anyone. I spent those 4 months, in between legal filings, designing the new bakery layout, sourcing equipment from auctions, and hiring back my old crew with promises of a reopening date I didn't announce publicly. I remember walking through the empty hardware store with a flashlight, the floor dusty and the air still smelling faintly of sawdust and ancient paint thinner, and I could see exactly where the proofer would go, where the counter would face the morning sun, where the window seat would let customers watch the street. I would let the daily rise die completely, then I would resurrect the community's trust from a clean space across the street. The confrontation took place on a bright spring morning, 2 years to the day after Arthur's funeral. I had sent Amanda and Greg a certified letter, framed as a mandatory meeting regarding the bakery's future lease structure, requesting their presence at the bakery at 9 a.m. to sign some paperwork. They arrived expecting to corner me into a settlement, perhaps to force me to sign over whatever rights they imagined I had left. I was already inside, standing behind the front counter, wearing a freshly pressed white baker's coat with my name, Sarah Richter, embroidered in dark green thread over the left chest. Elaine Brubaker stood to my left in a gray suit, holding a leather portfolio. 2 Gallia County Sheriff's deputies, a male and female, were stationed by the pastry case, their badges visible. The bakery around us was a shell of what it had been: dusty display racks, a cold oven, a bulletin board with outdated flyers curling at the edges. I had spent the previous day cleaning the space just enough to make it a stage, but the ghosts of neglect were still visible in the grout lines and the empty pastry case. The front door was unlocked, and I had positioned myself so that the morning light would hit their faces when they walked in, making it harder for them to see me clearly at first. Greg walked in first, saw the uniforms, and his step faltered. "What is this?" he said, his voice a little too high. Amanda followed, holding a manila folder I assumed contained yet another fraudulent document. She was wearing a navy blazer she probably thought projected authority, but it was rumpled at the collar, and I could see a coffee stain on the sleeve. I placed a 3-ring binder on the counter, its cover a simple clear plastic sleeve. I opened it to the first page, a copy of the deed of transfer from the previous owner to C&D Properties LLC, recorded at the Gallia County Recorder's Office 10 years earlier. The page was crisp, a certified copy stamped by the Recorder's Office. I slid it toward them. I said, slowly and clearly, "You evicted me from an apartment I own using a lease you forged on an inkjet printer. You claim to inherit a building that was never Arthur's to give. You stole $75,000 from a life insurance policy my husband intended for me. And for 2 years you have occupied my commercial property without paying a single dollar in rent while I slept in your guest room and fixed your appliances. As of today, that arrangement is over." Amanda's face went through 3 stages so rapidly it was like watching a bad edit. Confusion, then fury, then a slack, gray pallor as her brain tried to find a lie that would hold up. She pointed at the binder and said, "This is fake. I have the lease. Dad owned this place." I nodded at Elaine, who handed Amanda a certified copy of the Gallia County Auditor's property record, a public document showing C&D Properties LLC as the owner since the date of purchase, with the most recent annual report listing me, Sarah A. Richter, as the managing member and registered agent. Amanda's finger started to tremble against the paper. Greg grabbed it, scanned it, and his jaw tightened. He whispered something to Amanda that I couldn't hear, but it had the shape of title search, and you didn't check. The female deputy stepped forward, handed Greg a thick envelope containing the eviction summons and a copy of the civil complaint for damages. She said, "You've been served." Greg started yelling something about elder abuse, and this is entrapment, but the deputies were already directing them out the door. I looked directly at Amanda, who was rooted to the spot, her face now mottled with rage. I delivered the line I had been polishing in my head for 18 months, ever since I'd lain on their rug while they stepped over me. You handed me a forged lease, so I'm handing you a real one. That binder contains a 30-day notice to vacate and an invoice for the market rate rent you should have been paying since the day you locked me out of my own building. You can pay it now, or we can let a judge decide how much interest accrues starting from the date of your first false claim. On $100, $800 at 18% per annum, that's about $18, $144 in interest each year you delay. Do the math. Amanda's mouth opened and closed. She said, "You'll never get a penny, you crazy old woman." I just smiled. I had already done the math. I had a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet would become a judgment. And that judgment would become a ghost that followed her into every financial decision she attempted for the rest of her natural life. Within an hour, I had a locksmith rekey all the exterior doors. I unplugged the fryer that no one had cleaned properly, threw away the moldy sheet trays, and opened the windows to air out the smell of stale grease. I called my old crew, 3 of whom had been working part-time at a supermarket bakery in Huntington, West Virginia, waiting for my call. We spent the next week cleaning and repairing, but not to reopen. I was preparing the building for sale. I sold it 6 weeks later to a couple from Cincinnati who wanted to open a bookstore with a small café, and I used a portion of the proceeds to finish funding the new bakery across the street. The legal aftermath was exactly as precise as I'd planned. The civil case never went to trial because Amanda and Greg had no money to litigate. They tried to hire a lawyer on contingency, but no attorney would take a case where the defendants had already been indicted for fraud and the paper trail was a mile long. They defaulted on the civil complaint, and I obtained a default judgment for the full amount. $100, $800 in back rent, $75, $000 in insurance theft converted to a personal judgment after restitution was ordered, $26, $300 in legal fees, and $14, $700 in property damage to the apartment, which they had degraded and attempted to rent out to short-term tenants who had trashed the carpets and punched holes in the walls. The total judgment, with pre-judgment interest, was just over $242,000. The criminal case pled out to a single count of felony insurance fraud against Amanda, who accepted a deal of 3 years probation and a restitution order for the $75,000 she had attempted to steal. I remember sitting in the courtroom when the judge read the restitution terms. Amanda was crying, but they were the tears of someone who was angry she got caught, not someone who was sorry. Greg was not sentenced to jail because he cooperated with the prosecution, throwing Amanda under the bus in the process. But his real estate license was suspended and later revoked after the state board reviewed the fraud allegations. The Lexus was repossessed from the driveway one morning while Amanda watched from the window, her fingers pressed against the glass, and their house went into foreclosure 6 months later. Last I heard, Greg was selling used cars on a gravel lot off Interstate 71, and Amanda was working as a receptionist for a chiropractor in Parkersburg, her wages garnished by the restitution order and the civil judgment. She had to report every address change to the court, and any new employer received a garnishment order within 30 days of her start date. I reopened my bakery in the new building across the street, a sunlit corner space with an open kitchen, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a name I had chosen in the guest room one night, The Second Rise. I teach bread-making classes on Sunday afternoons, and I keep a framed copy of Arthur's note on my kitchen windowsill, next to a yellowed trust document from my grandmother. Every quarter, I receive an automated email from the court's judgment registry showing the accruing balance on Amanda's debt. It is now north of $260,000. She will never pay it off, and that's the point. Every credit card application, every car loan, every rental application she submits, that judgment appears like a ghost she created, brick by brick, with her own arrogance and a fake notary stamp. I didn't scream. I didn't fight in the open. I waited, I watched, I documented, and I outlasted. I let them build their own ruin, and then I handed them the final bill. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe that patient, methodical justice is the sweetest bread of all, hit like and subscribe. I'll be back next week with another story from the kitchen.